What's up guys, I'm KBHD here. 755 product launches later, we've made it through Techtober, took a little breath, and now we're right back at it with November, and it just keeps going. And I've started my November with this. This is the iPhone XR. And this phone already has a bit of a reputation, but ideally with my testing and hopefully in this review, we can look past that little reputation and figure out what this phone really is. I mean, it's another iPhone, and I already reviewed the iPhone, the XS, so I'll leave that link to the review below. But this one is very similar in a lot of ways with the new parts and the new design, but with some key differences. So for this video, let's look at everything that's different about the iPhone XR that adds up to $250 cheaper and what I think of it. Okay, so first things first is the size. The iPhone XR sits right in between the XS and the XS Max with this 6.1-inch display. It's fine. I'm one of those people who wishes there was an even smaller iPhone so that the difference was more apparent, but this 6.1-inch display kind of splits the middle. It's definitely harder for most people to reach the corners and the tops of this display because it is so big. That's one of those things though that you can check out just by getting in a store and seeing for yourself. But this size for me is fine. And then the build. The iPhone XR is made from different materials and it's built differently than the XS, even with pretty much the same looking design. There's no stainless steel here. iPhone XR has anodized aluminum sides, which means they can color match them to get it to match the glass backs. And yes, there are the 6 new colors. And I know I've said before the red is my favorite, and yes, it still is, but I'm gonna go ahead and give my second place to this blue. I really like it. I think it's quite nice. The coral and the yellow don't really speak to me as much, I think mostly because of the rail colors being a little less saturated, and the black and the white are just black and white. So the red and the blue are definitely my 2 favorite XR colors. Also, small difference, the iPhone XR's water resistance is IP67, where the iPhone XS was IP68, so worth noting. And you'll also notice the slightly different locations for the antenna bands. The XR is missing a couple, just a pair of visible bands that are on the XS. And the XR, since it lacks these bands, does not have gigabit LTE, and this only affects a tiny number of people who are actually in an area where their carrier supports gigabit LTE, but hey, it's different, so there you have it. Overall, I'm mostly a fan of the build of the XR. I think the colors are awesome. They didn't have to do colors, so I'm glad they did. The backs with the glass are super saturated and bright and vibrant, but the aluminum on all the colors on the rails is always less saturated than the glass, which makes sense, but it's kind of a bummer if you put a case or a skin on it, because then you hide the awesome color of the glass and you just get the metal. It's not the end of the world, but just had to point that out. Also, with the aluminum, it's even more slippery than the stainless steel. This is, I think, the new slipperiest phone in the world, champ, prone to sliding out of your pockets if you're not careful, so be careful. Okay, so the display. This is the biggest difference versus the iPhone XS. This is why Apple was able to make this phone that costs $250 less. This is why this phone even has a reputation already before people even get to use it. This is the most controversial part of this phone. iPhone XR has what Apple calls a liquid retina display. You can ignore the fancy name, but it's an LCD with curved corners. It's 1792 by 828, and it's surrounded by this slightly thicker bezel. The panel itself, it has great color and brightness, pretty good viewing angles, and believe it or not, it's actually crisp enough for me at regular use, though I do start to see it as less sharp than the XS when I pixel peep from close up. But it's really not a bad display by any means. It's accurate, it's vibrant. It feels like the easiest way to make the iPhone XR's display seem bad is to focus entirely on the numbers of it. Don't even look at the display, just look at the spec sheet and the numbers on paper. It's less than 1080p, and it's 326 pixels per inch. That's the pixel density. You know what else has that pixel density? The iPhone 4. That's an easy way to make it look bad. But you know what else has a pixel density of 326 pixels per inch? The iPhone 8. And that was fine. Most people didn't complain about that, and that was a great display. So really, focusing on the numbers isn't the most productive thing. Just look at, well, the actual experience of using this phone and looking at the display. And in practice, the biggest losses for me with the XR display are no 3D touch, and no OLED. Apple did bring touch to wake to the XR, so you don't lose that, but obviously contrast in the black when you're watching a video isn't quite the same with an LCD, and even though this is one of the best LCDs, you're not gonna have the pitch blacks of an OLED. I personally didn't use 3D touch that much anyway, pretty much only in the control center and the lock screen. So on the XR, you can do almost the same thing with a long press that will work in the control center and on the lock screen shortcuts, but you can't peek and pop into links and previews and things like that. That's almost completely gone from the XR, but I honestly don't miss it that much. You still have True Tone, so if you're into that, I don't really use True Tone, but if you do, it's also here. And you have Tap to Wake, like I said, you have rounded corners. It's fine. the display. No need to panic. It's really fine. As a matter of fact, what I really noticed the most isn't the resolution, it isn't the lack of 3D touch, it's the bezels. These bezels all the way around here, just a couple millimeters thicker than the iPhone XS, are noticeable to me every day. And to be fair, after a little while, you do get used to it, but as a person that has used an iPhone XS, I much prefer that. It looks and feels that much more modern to shave, I guess, 1 or 2 millimeters all the way around the bezel. So sure, it's a bummer that you can't watch full 1080p videos, especially on this larger display. Trust me, 1440 does look a lot better, I would know. And it's a downgrade to LCD, and there's no 3D touch, but the bezels to me are actually the most consistently noticeable difference that you'll have, and you'll have to be okay with them if you're gonna rock this phone. All right, 2 quick ones. The RAM and the battery. Both of these are kind of a side effect of them going with the lower resolution display. First of all, there is 1 gig less of RAM, so 3 gigs of RAM instead of 4. But honestly, that's kind of all you need in iOS when you're pushing way less pixels and RAM management is already great. And then the battery. The iPhone XR has a 2,942 milliamp hour battery, and it's really good. Now, for most phones, that statement wouldn't really line up, but again, because that A12 Bionic is so powerful and it's pushing way less pixels, the iPhone XR's battery life is excellent, just as good as the XS Max, and sometimes better. It's one of the best parts of this phone. Of course, I would expect a phone this big to have all-day battery life just out of principle, but having it be better than I expected was a pleasant surprise. So that leaves the biggest difference, the camera. The single camera on the back of the iPhone XR, which is the exact same as the primary camera on the XS minus the second telephoto. Some people have noticed slightly different image quality from the XR's camera versus the XS. I have not. For me, it's still the same, a very good iPhone camera. But subtracting that telephoto lens has actually had some interesting implications that aren't all negative. So that telephoto camera, as you know, is good for 2 things, optical zoom and portrait mode. So optical zoom, yeah, that's gone. You concede a worse quality digital zoom. But here's a little not so secret about zoom on the iPhone. That telephoto lens has always been a worse quality sensor and image that just let in less light. So oftentimes in worse conditions, specifically low light, the iPhone will realize that the optical zoom coming from the darker lens is actually not as good as the primary, so it'll just take the digital zoom from the primary lens anyway. So yeah, there is no telephoto lens on the iPhone XR, but I think that affects a lot less zoom scenarios than we actually realize, and oftentimes we're gonna get better results from using the better camera. And then the other thing is portrait mode. So the XS would use both cameras for depth detection and then use the telephoto camera to zoom in for a better natural bokeh. The XR portrait mode obviously doesn't do this, which means it's always using the better quality primary camera, and it's a wider angle. And I don't know if you've noticed, but wider angle portraits with a shallow depth of field is kind of my favorite look. It's kind of a thing. I think it's the most visually interesting version of a portrait. So I kind of really like this. They've remapped the background blur to look more like a wide angle optic than telephoto, and it makes a real difference through all the bokeh adjustment. I really do notice it. The background feels kind of more swirly sometimes, like they have more character. But there is of course a downside, which is that it doesn't have depth detection anymore at all, so it's doing pretty much all of the work with software. And with that, Apple has limited it to photos of human faces only. So if you try to take a portrait mode of anything else, it won't work. It'll tell you it's kind of waiting for a person to be detected. So that's kind of a bummer. No portrait shots of objects, which I started doing more on plenty of other Android phones, but that's the price you pay in Apple's world. So all those previous points have added up to the iPhone XR starting at $750 for 64 gigs. Definitely not a budget phone. Don't let anyone tell you it's a budget phone. But at $250 cheaper than the iPhone XS, this is a much better deal. The biggest downsides are the display and the camera. I know a lot of things I kind of spoke about in the camera were pretty positive, but don't let me fool you into thinking it's a better camera. Those are the biggest downsides of this phone, but those are when comparing it to the iPhone XS. But a lot of people are coming from iPhone 8 and iPhone 7 and older, and for those people, this is an upgrade in pretty much every possible way, and for not much more money. The iPhone 8 started for $700, this is $750. So my conclusion is pretty much the same as I suspected when this phone first got announced, which is this is the bestseller iPhone for everyone. They didn't even have to do colors. Imagine if they just did a black and white iPhone XR, a little more boring, probably would have flown more under the radar. But the fact that they did the colors is kind of like a cherry on top. So if you're one of those people who was already gonna get an iPhone XS or XS Max, You probably still should, just like I said in the review. It's not like you should switch to this instead of that. But if you're on one of those older phones, iPhone XR is a good upgrade. I recommend it. There's nothing to panic about, nothing crazy wrong with it. Thumbs up for me on this phone. That's been it. Thanks for watching. Talk to you in the next one.